encourage people to exercise more. Oh, okay. And how to encourage people to pay their taxes and come to court on time. So this is something that really didn't exist. The idea of using behavioral science in government at this scale and scope when I started doing this kind of research 20 years ago. But now there are behavioral insights in public policy institutions all around the world. So with this rise of influence of behavioral science comes a need for really strong evidence-based policy advice. And I think hopefully it's non-controversial to say that ideally, when we are offering policy advice, not only do we have lab evidence, but ideally we also have field experiments telling us not only, well, this is true, but here's the magnitude of the effect. And that tells you something about the cost effectiveness of a tool you might want to use to change citizens' behavior in a positive direction. So field experiments are great, but when we want to use them to influence policy, we have some challenges that we face. One is that running field experiments requires really huge fixed costs and it's slow, right? You have to build relationships with field partners. It can take years to figure out the legal contracts and collect the data. It's a hassle. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is that even when we actually are in the lucky situation of having field experiments that we could look at before offering policy advice on a problem like how do we encourage more savings in a population, for instance, often looking at effect sizes across study is going to require us to make apples to oranges comparisons, right? We have one study of Danish adults, another of Californians. And when we try to say, well, you know, it worked this well to do this one thing here, and it worked this well to do this other thing there, we're not really sure, are those numbers comparable? And is it feasible to say one's more cost effective than the other, which is what we care about when offering policy advice. There's also a replication crisis that I think for good reason has gotten a lot of attention in our field. And it's not always clear as a result of that, which behavioral insights will be robust and valuable to deploy in the field. And of course, the file drawer means, you know, say I ran an experiment and I found a tool that I thought would be effective in one setting didn't work. I'm not incentivized to publish that, so I tuck it away. And as a result, others may go try to use the same tool in the field and fail to find that it's effective, and nobody knows. So that's a problem. Can you hear me now? Okay, I was muted and unmuted. Okay, great. Okay, so what's the solution? Well, first of all, I want to say I'm going to offer a solution. There's not the only solution, but I hope could be one solution to these challenges. And that solution is the idea of running mega studies. So what is a mega study? And PS, I'm not just going to talk about this in theory, I brought data. So I'm going to share 3 example mega studies today with you. So a mega study is a very large field experiment in which many smaller sub-experiments are run synchronously with the same dependent variable. So there are a number of benefits of running mega studies if your goal is to inform policy. One is that it's going to allow for comparability of results across all of these sub-studies within the mega study. So if you have multiple ideas about a way to change a policy relevant behavior, you want to use social norms and you want to use defaults and you'd like to use loss aversion. If you run all of these different tests at once in a single mega study, you can say, oh, look, this treatment is more cost effective than this other. It also means that the fixed costs of executing a field experiment can be borne by a single central organizer, which lowers the marginal costs for individual scientists of submitting their ideas and contributing. It reduces the risk of learning nothing from a field study because now you've thrown so many things at the wall, even with, you know, once you've done your proper multiple hypothesis correction, something is still likely to stick. And you're probably going to come away with some positive results. And it also eliminates the file drawer problem because now you can publish those null results right alongside the positive results and put it all out there. And you're not going to have this issue that journals don't like publishing null findings. This can also be run as a tournament with interdisciplinary teams, which I find really exciting because in our field, there's been lots of benefits from cross-pollination, but of course, there are also incentives to publish in our own siloed journals, work in our own siloed way. And because the design of a mega study is that there are sub-studies embedded in it, if you have a team of economists who want to do research in their way and publish in their journals, they can still contribute their sub-study right alongside a team of psychologists who wants to publish in a different journal and has a different set of design considerations. And then they'll all be pooled in this mega study and comparable. Another benefit that I will just say we have not realized, I'm going to again present some mega studies today. I was very bullish on this, and maybe you all will have interesting ideas about why we didn't get as far with it so far as we'd hoped. But one thing we were very excited about and hope we'll see more in the future is the potential for behavioral phenotyping, which is a fancy way of saying looking at what treatments benefit who and understanding that there may be differences and what works best for different subpopulations. So when you run a study that has 20, 30, 50 different treatments, it's much easier to imagine finding subpopulations that do really well with a certain treatment, even though that's not the best treatment on average. So that seems like an exciting opportunity for tailoring. In the studies I'm going to present to you today, I'm not even going to share results on this because it was really a dog that didn't bark. We really didn't see interesting sort of differences among subgroups for the most part, but you could imagine that in the future, this is something that could be happen more with field mega studies. Okay, and finally, and maybe this is where I should have even started, the idea of a mega study is also that it can accelerate the pace of scientific discovery, because instead of doing this one at a time research, we can do dozens of studies simultaneously and really accelerate what we learn. Okay, I want to point out that this is not that wildly new of an idea. In many ways, this has been happening in other fields for some time. And I think one particularly relevant comparison is to the common task framework, which revolutionized artificial intelligence field about 15 years ago. And what the common task framework did is it said, if you're working on a problem in AI, say you're interested in improving image recognition algorithms, instead of just sort of having your own pet data set that you're going to analyze in order to figure out what works, everyone in this community is going to use the same data set, the same validation method. We're going to have transparency in terms of what hypotheses we're testing, and we'll be able to make apples to apples comparisons. And if you think about some of our workhorse games that we use in our workhorse paradigms in the lab, like the prisoner's dilemma game, at some level it has a similar flavor, right? The idea of reusing the same tools and validating in the same way to see whether or not something holds up. There's also, of course, scientific tournaments, which are similar in flavor, where different teams will compete to design something, but they don't tend to involve random assignment. So what we're trying to do is sort of take these ideas, put them together in a way that yields something we think is even more promising. Okay, so the first mega study I'm going to tell you about is a paper that we actually just published in Nature at the end of last year. And it was our very first effort to do this. It was in partnership with 24 Hour Fitness, which is a 4 million member gym chain with roughly 400 locations around the United States. After I'll present this in some detail, and after I present this, I will actually turn to two fresher mega studies that we did in the fall of 2020, both with the goal of encouraging or understanding how we could better encourage vaccination, recognizing that vaccinating large swaths of the population for COVID-19 would be a really important policy problem, and that behavioral scientists might be able to offer insights that could be useful at scale there. So the two mega studies I'll talk about were done with actually flu shots in fall 2020, but with our eye on the development of vaccines to be available very shortly thereafter. And we were hoping essentially to provide a test bed so that we could then roll out the best ideas to a large population when COVID vaccines were ready. So that's the components of today's talk. I'm going to start with this 24 Hour Fitness, but we'll get to some more policy relevant, really recent stuff shortly. Okay, so this is not shockingly the procedure I'll follow in sharing the mega study results from the 24 Hour Fitness. I'm going to start with our rationale. We'll get through all the usual stuff. And I just want to mention, I'll forecast that we are going to talk a little bit about predictions, because I think that's an interesting aspect of these mega studies. If a team of experts or even novices could just take all the study designs that are proposed in a tournament like this and figure out which ones are going to be the best. Maybe you don't even need the mega study. You just sort of have a mega competition to launch and you have people forecast what will work and then you throw out everything but the best ideas, I will foreshadow the prediction accuracy is not strong enough to support that way of doing these kinds of things. Okay. So you might be wondering, it's going to be obvious why I talk about vaccines in a little bit, but why would we have started and done our very first mega study to promote physical activity? I think is a valid question I get a lot. Like, is that the most pressing policy problem? And there's a few answers that I will give to that question that might be in your mind of why we started here. First of all, actually, physical activity is a bigger problem than I certainly appreciated. In the US, which is where I have the best data, only half of Americans exercise sufficiently, and exercise is kind of like the closest thing we've found to the fountain of youth. It lowers all sorts of bad outcomes. Alzheimer's disease, coronary heart disease, stroke, hypertension, improves mental health. It is really quite incredible. And actually 9% of premature global mortality is attributable to insufficient physical activity. So it maybe is more important than you might think. But even more important to me, I will admit, is that it's really measurable. So we can measure a high frequency decision objectively, and it's become sort of the fruit fly for anyone interested in the study of habit because of that. So unlike eating or smoking decisions, we can rely on objective measures of whether or not people really show up at the gym, because they typically have to, enter by swiping a badge in. And so we're not just stuck with self-report data. And we were interested in repeated behavior and durable change. Okay, so our first mega study involved 30 different scientists. And oops, I'm seeing something in chat. Oh, mailing list. Okay, great. I don't need to respond to that. In our first mega study, 30 scientists designed, get my clicker working again, 20 different pre-registered research studies, so each with its own treatment control and sometimes multiple treatment arms. And this led to the design of 53 total different experimental treatments that we launched. And there was one control group, which I'll mention in more detail in a moment. Scientists could vary the sign-up experience members of 24-hour fitness gyms had when the program began. So people say, I want to be a part of this program that'll help me improve my, hopefully, exercise habits. And when they sign up on a website. I'll show you the design of that in a moment. Researchers knew that in their treatment designs, what they could do is they could vary what that experience is like. So what, do people have to answer questions? Do they see videos? Or what instructions are they provided with at that point when they're signing up? They could also vary incentives that people receive for observable behavior. So they could get incentives for exercise, for responding to text messages, etc. They could vary the content of reminders that people received to visit the gym. And they could vary weekly emails that were sent for up to 28 days, as well as up to 3 interactive text messages sent per week. So those are the degrees of freedom. So it's pretty limited what scientists could do in a sense, but it's, it's not terrible. There's a number of things they can change. Okay, so first of all, let me talk a little bit about a couple of key features of the design. First of all, we had a placebo control condition that was in this study. The placebo control involved people sign up for this program that is marketed as designed by scientists to try to help you kickstart a healthy exercise habit that'll last a month. If they sign up for the experiment and are assigned to the placebo control condition, they're welcome to the program, encouraged to exercise more, and then they never hear from us again, essentially until the end of the program. So it's basically an empty shell of a program. The one thing that we give them, and this is to try to equalize incentives across condition, is as soon as they sign up, they earn points for signing up that are equal in value to the expected incentives people will earn in most of the other experimental conditions. Okay, so that's our placebo holdout. We also had a sort of best practices treatment. And what we put into this best practices treatment was what past research suggests might be useful. And that included prompting people to make a plan for the dates and times when they would exercise over the next 4 weeks, sending them text reminders, 15, maybe it was actually 30 minutes before each of those planned workouts, and then offering them what we call micro incentives, so points that are convertible for an Amazon gift card at the end of the program. So the points sound meaningful. They're like a few hundred points, but they're actually worth about 20 cents for every gym visit. So not a very large incentive, and that's simply a budget constraint. Okay, so this is the most basic version. Then we have the placebo control, and then scientists layered new features on top of this. They could change the incentives, they could change the content of the reminders, they could change really whatever they wanted. And if I, again, tell you about every single research study proposed and designed, we won't have time to get to much data, but let me just say this is sort of a wide range of ideas ranging from, let me tweak the way the incentives are structured in order to try to test a theory I have about how incentives change behavior, to let me try to change people's mindset about exercise. Let me try to do a nudge versus a boost, where I either explain to you how I'm trying to change your behavior or just try to change your behavior with a tool. So there's a wide range of ideas tested. And what I'm going to do is I'll show you the range of outcomes and also the very best performers. Okay, so everyone who was a 24-hour fitness member as of April 1st of 2018 was invited to register in this program that was designed by scientists to create exercise habits. And we had a nice website that was designed by real professional designers. It looked like a commercial website. We recruited participants for about 10 months, and our final sample included almost 63,000 people. They were a little bit more female than male. Their average age was about 40 years old, but wide variance. They'd been gym members for longer than maybe it would be ideal. Like they'd been doing this for a while on average. They were somewhat geographically diverse in their locations around the US, but skewed towards California, which is where 24-hour fitness has its biggest presence. They visited on average the gym about once in the last month prior to registrations. They were not on average super loyal gym goers, which makes sense because these are people who are trying to figure out if this program can help them get more engaged. And about half of them had made at least one visit a week though in the prior 4 weeks. Okay, so this just gives you a little bit more of a visual of what it looked like to be in this study, what your experience would be like. So we optimized for mobile because we assumed a lot of people would be using their smartphones to sign up, but this all looked quite nice if you're on a computer screen as well. So you come to a nice looking website. It invites you to join a habit building science-based workout program. You get to a page, if you click, join now, that shows you the terms and conditions, which we're pretty used to. Terms and conditions are also a consent form in this case, right? So they're explaining that you're going to be in a research program and that you might have different experiences from others because we're testing and refining. Then you provide your contact information. And this is important because it gives us your email address and your cell phone number, which is how we'll communicate with you throughout the course of the program. We actually required you to validate, you get a little text with a 4-digit number, something you have to type in. And if you validate that you really received our text, then you're randomly assigned to conditions. Okay, so randomization happens here. Some people are assigned to a placebo control, but most people aren't, right? About 5% go to a placebo control and the other 95% go to our experimental conditions. And most of the experimental conditions have a flow that looks something like the following. Most of them start by telling you about the rewards you'll earn for exercise. And again, the rewards you'll earn may be different because of your experimental treatments. Some people, this is the main thing or some scientists, this is the main thing they're playing with. But the baseline rewards in our sort of most basic version of this treatment, say you've earned 100 points for registering, you'll get 300 points every time you work out. And those are convertible for an Amazon gift card. And we give the conversion rate, which again, it's meant to make it a little hard to figure this out just so you're not focused on how small the rewards are, but it's about 20 cents per gym visit. Then most people see a planning screen where they choose the dates and times when they'll exercise each day of the week, and then the week repeats 4 times. So we don't give you the flexibility to schedule an entire 28 days where every day is distinct. Which is anyway a design choice, but every Monday you'll have the same timing, every Tuesday and so on. You'll get text messages at the times you schedule or shortly before them to remind you to go. Many A/B tests that aren't focused on incentives inserted more screens in the middle here showing you a survey or a video or additional information that might change your behavior. And then people are congratulated and they're reminded this is a 28-day program that will involve text messages 30 minutes before workouts, customized texts that are interactive throughout, and weekly emails. And then throughout the next 28 days, we reinforced whatever treatment people were assigned to. Ooh,
Short question, the plan was the same for everyone, or is it also varied across treatment?
The plan, your workouts, is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
The planning is something that a couple of different research teams did play with. So I think there was a
So
team
it's
that
not the same for all.
That's right. But it was the same for many. It was not the main thing that scientists ended up futzing with. I would say it was pretty consistent. This is what people saw, but there was a version where you chose a weekday time and a weekend time instead of a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I think that might be the only variant. And one screen that had like a little extra information about why you were making a plan. But mostly this is what people saw across the 53 treatments.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And then let's see, I see another chat that says, was there consideration of the risk of over encouraging too many gym visits to the extent that it's not beneficial to their health anymore? I would say no, that we didn't really focus on that potential risk. And we're following a large literature on habit formation that sort of ignores that possibility. When you see the data, you probably will be less concerned about that risk because the degree to which we're changing gym attendance, and that most of these studies do, is not enough that on average, we're not creating workout-aholics, if you will. So yeah, we're going to see order of magnitude. Maybe we get someone going to the gym 30% more would be a really good result. And you remember they're going once a month. So we're not, we're not turning many people into gym fiends. Yeah. Okay, so they get these text reminders 30 minutes before scheduled workouts. They get interactive texts that reinforce whatever the central idea or premise of the study design is, right? Basically just trying to keep it top of mind for 28 days. And they also received messages from us once a week in an email that tended to try to reinforce, again, the main treatment idea and reminded people of their weekly schedule. Okay, so how did this all turn out? Well, first thing I want to just show you is a balance check, because when we run a big study, we always worry like, was there imbalance and observables across treatment arms, and we're randomly assigning for 10 months, and we had some fancy things in our random assignment that were complicated and I won't get into, but they're in our paper. At any rate, the good news is that things look quite balanced. So when we look at paired t-tests, basically look at like every condition compared to every other, only 7.1 are statistically significant on age, and rate 5% should be. So that's the most imbalanced thing. But if we do an F test overall, it's still not significant. Pre-intervention length, meaning like how many weeks were they members before they signed up? That looks balanced across conditions. Average weekly gym visits in the 4 weeks prior to intervention is balanced. Gender is balanced. And those are the key observables we have. So we're feeling pretty good about our balance here. We also want to just take a look at the placebo control condition and how that responded. And this is going to be, within condition. I'll of course show you across condition, but this is going to be our baseline condition. So it's an important comparison to just have a sense of what that looked like if we do it before or after for all the participants here. And what you can see is that maybe there's like a tick up slightly among the people who are about to sign up for this program, meaning like, if you choose to sign up for this program, it probably reveals something about what you're going through in your life right now that you're interested in signing up for a gym program, right? In the last week, you've gotten a little more excited about exercise, and then that ticks right back down fairly quickly. So our placebo treatment doesn't look like it had any effect on gym attendance, which is nice. And we're going to use that as our comparison against which all the other treatments are measured. Okay. So this is a ugly graph, and I apologize for that. I am going to orient you to it. It is not meant for you to, I don't want you to read all the things on the y-axis. It'll make you dizzy. I want to show you a distributional result. That's why I'm showing this. So on the x-axis, okay, we've run a big regression where we're estimating the treatment effects, and we're looking at the weekly estimated increase in gym visits, and we have a fixed effect for each of our 53 treatment conditions. We're estimating how they increase gym attendance relative to the placebo control. And so the placebo control is the 0 point. And each dot on this graph shows you an estimated treatment effect relative to the placebo of one of our treatment conditions. So to the right of this gray line means that the estimated treatment effect is positive. And then I've got 95% confidence intervals around each treatment effect. So what you can see, the first important thing to note is that basically all of the treatments we tried had positive estimated effects with the exception of one, maybe you'd say three, but two are zeros, one is slightly negative, and the rest are positive. So the good news is like, okay, the things that behavioral scientists are trying to increase gym visits are generally not backfiring. That's great. And they're generally producing some small benefit on, and that's our estimate. But then like, is the benefit meaningful? Well, now let's think about what fraction of the treatments are showing overlap in their 95% confidence intervals with that zero placebo. And the answer is it's pretty decent. 45% of the treatments are outperforming the placebo without adjusting p-values at all. But of course, you'd expect 2.5% should have a positive effect just by random chance, and 45% are showing a positive effect. So maybe 40%, 42.5%, something like that is the right answer in terms of how many are benefiting people significantly. So that's pretty good. Like, more than a third are having a significant positive effect that you can trust. Okay, now let's get a little bit more critical here. How about outperforming our sort of best practices treatment? So how much innovation did we generate here over and above what, if we just looked at the past literature and said, like, what do we think would be useful here and put that into a treatment? How many of the treatments outperform that? Well, now that things get a little hairier or dicier, less rosy, treatment 30 is our planning, reminders, and micro incentives condition. And by the way, these are numerically ordered in terms of their estimated treatment effects. So the 30th best out of the 53 things we tried was the treatment that was based on past research and said, let's just have people make a plan. Let's remind them to go at the times they plan to go. And let's send them incentives, cash incentives worth about 20 cents for every gym visit. Well, that did okay. And only 9% of our treatments actually significantly outperformed this. So it was pretty tough to beat this best practices treatment. Plenty of things, maybe a little less than 2/3 outperformed it directionally, but only a small fraction of things. And again, it's more than would by chance, because only 2.5% would by chance, but it's not a lot more than would by chance. So it was hard to beat this. It was hard to outperform what we already had. But a few things did. So I'm gonna focus attention there. And you can do various ways of correcting for multiple comparisons. I will just say in this particular paper, I'm not gonna correct for multiple comparisons in my p-values, but you'll see everything I present to you is p is less than 0.001, and they would all survive any multiple comparisons correction you wanna throw at them. In the next two studies that I'm gonna present slightly less detail, I'm gonna use a traditional correction procedure. I will just say we've like gotten better at thinking about correction as we've done this work. Okay, so first, the big winner, and this is a study that was designed by Harvard's John Bashir's in collaboration with me and Angela, and also Dina Grome, who's the director of the Behavior Change for Good initiative and a PhD psychologist. So the treatment that worked best, I find really interesting. This is a treatment where the goal was to encourage participants never to miss more than one scheduled visit in a row. And it did this in a very, I'll say, it incentivized it, but in a low-powered way. So participants learned that they would earn, instead of just the usual 20 cents that they could earn per gym visits, if they missed a visit that had been scheduled, and then they came back for the next scheduled visit after that, right? So say you'd scheduled to go to the gym Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, you missed Thursday. Now, if you come back on Friday, you'll earn an extra 9 cents on top of your usual 20-cent reward. So people, I don't think, were strategically skipping a workout in order to get that whole extra 9 cents, right? It's meant to be like a small enough inducement that it wouldn't lead to strategic skips, but maybe large enough that you're a little extra interested in not missing 2 in a row. And it might be more that it's a nudge, like not to have a streak of misses, than it's the cash reward itself, since 9 cents isn't even going to cover the cost of gas for most people to get to the gym. But this turned out to be quite powerful. So I think there's something interesting here that's worth digging into further, related to trying to get people not to, if you break a streak of successes, to not let that, we called it sort of not falling off the wagon. Don't let that turn into a series of misses, only one. And this increased gym visits by 27% during our program. And if you just look at the this is, I've subtracted the placebo group off of this. You can see maybe it's declining in its effectiveness a little bit over time, although that's not a statistically significant trend, but you can just see visually that there's like a nice bump from the pre-treatment period up to the treatment period in this condition. Let's see, got a chat. Oh, I don't know if the recorded video will be available for playback, so I'll let someone else answer
Depends on
that.
your behavior. We will think about it. But probably yes. Yes, don't worry.
Randomly
If you,
assigned to a mega study condition.
if you allow us, then yes, it will be available.
I like that I would pay far more than 9 cents to not go to a gym. Okay, fair enough. And I should say, of course, all this was done pre-COVID when we weren't nervous about germs in gyms. Okay, so let me show you another one of the top performers, which is pretty boring, but also it's kind of neat to see this in the mix. I think it's a useful measuring stick. We had one condition that just paid people a lot more than all the rest. So basically it inflated the incentives by almost a factor of 10. People are paid about $2 now for every workout. This increased gym visits by 25%. So good old fashioned incentives work just fine. But I think it's kind of neat that actually we saw the sort of 9-cent bonus that's strategically timed was every bit as effective as these superpowered. They're not that high, but a couple bucks for going to the gym. But just increasing incentives works. And you can see the size of that effect. Here's another behavioral insight, and this proposal came from Robert Cialdini, who probably we're all familiar with his wonderful work on the power of social norms. He's really interested in this, some new research that had shown not only is it helpful and effective to tell you everybody else is doing something, but it can be particularly potent when we say there's a trend. So not only is everyone doing it, but the numbers are growing. So you're really going to get lost if you don't follow through. There was data available from surveys of Americans that suggested, if you sort of sliced and diced the numbers correctly, that Americans were exercising more than they had been before. And we showed people graphs and said, look, numbers are up, exercise is a growing trend around the United States. And telling people that and reinforcing it through text messages increased gym visits by 24%. So social norms that were growing that was a big winner. And actually looks like there's growth in its effect over time. But again, I think that's not statistically significant, just interesting to note. Yes, great question from someone about, is there post-incentive, did we measure what happened in the weeks after? I will get to that. So it's coming. So hold on, promise. Let's see. But yes, we did measure that. And that was part of what we're interested in. Okay, this is a replication essentially of the 9-cent bonus. So we actually had 2 different versions of that sort of will pay you not to miss a gym visit after you've missed one. So come back after a miss. One paid people 9 cents, the other paid 16 cents. It was a carefully executed design for various reasons. We want to vary anyway, but both of these were in the top 5 performers, which is sort of like an internal replication, which is kind of neat. So it's interesting that the 9 cents was slightly higher than the 16, but they're not statistically distinguishable. And this one looks like it's going up and the other looked like it was going down. I don't think that's very meaningful, but nice replication that this seems to be a robust effect. Okay, the final treatment that performed quite well that I wanted to mention is that we gave people a choice in one treatment condition. This was designed by Juwon Kim, who's a PhD student at Wharton who's about to start a faculty job at the Yale School of Management. She designed a treatment with Barb Mellers and Lyle Unger where participants got to choose whether or not they would be given incentives in a loss or gain framed way. So that would they hear about each time they missed a gym visit, they hear, oh, you lost these points, or would they hear, oh, you're gaining these points? And that ability to customize and choose which way you wanted to be communicated with about your incentives increased gym visits by 19%. Okay, so these 5 treatments I think have a lot of potential and are worth further follow-up and trying to really dig into the mechanisms behind them. Each one would, again, survive multiple hypothesis correction. These p-values in terms of their outperforming of the placebo are all very highly significant, and they also all significantly outperform our planning rewards and reminders condition. And I think they tell us interesting things about the world and suggest ways that we could try to change behavior in a durable way by trying to reduce the sense that, you can trying to get people not to miss more than one in a row of something that they value, using these increasing social norms, and finally giving people some choice in the way they're communicated with about incentives. Let me just say our results are very robust to different ways of looking at this, different outcome measures. But heterogeneity, I will say, is a dog that didn't bark. So we have a team of machine learning experts who's been working on heterogeneity analyses, and they have not found a lot when they've gone hunting using the best available methods, which I think is surprising but interesting. There's a little, like you can do a little bit better if you apply machine learning and forecast what will work best for whom and tailor interventions, but it's a very small effect. Okay, actually I lied. I'm going to talk for just a minute about the durable effects, since there was a question. And then I'll come, well, actually, okay, sorry. I have another question that I'm going to get to first, which is Quarter's question. For choosing one reinforcement scheme, did the choice between gains and loss framing predict its effectiveness? It's a great question. I know that the team did analyze this, but because it's endogenous, we didn't pay a huge amount of attention to it. There were actually loss and gain frame controls that were randomly assigned. Like you didn't get to choose, you just got a loss frame or a gain frame. Neither was terribly effective. But in this one, I believe more people chose gains than losses, but I don't remember if that correlated with success. I will have to ask Juan and follow up. So I apologize for that. But I do think it's interesting that the choice outperformed the assignment. Although I don't remember if that was I think it was like a marginal result. Okay, let me talk briefly about post-incentive results, because it looks like in this particular deck, because I wanted to make sure I'd get to the results on vaccines, that I think I left out the durable effects. Overall, the durability of these treatments is about the same as in past GYM studies that have looked at habit formation. About 30% of a treatment effect carries over into the post-treatment period. So very consistent. If you're familiar with like Charnas-Ganese or Auckland and Levy, or some other work I've done on GYM incentives, when you get people to change their behavior for a month, there's about 30% carryover after you remove the incentive. What that means is it's actually really hard to, when we look at the study en masse, like all the data, we pool all the treatments, we can see that 30% carryover. When we look at any individual treatment, we're quite underpowered to see if it has a statistically significant durable effect. I think about 8% of treatments did, which is a little bit more than would by chance, but it's that global zoom out. And we didn't see any like huge outliers where it's like, well, this only increased GYM attendance a little bit during the treatment period, but then boom, it really had carryover effects. It was a pretty strong correlation. Like if it increased treatment, if it increased GYM visits more during the month, then there was more durability. So basically, the more lift you can get during a treatment, the more lift you retain after, is the short, sort of boring takeaway. But it is consistent with other habit formation research. Okay, we did want to see, can people predict what works best? And what we did to do this is we recruited participants to predict the effects of the 53 different step-up treatments. We had one study that involved prolific workers, just survey respondents paid to do this. They made 903 predictions, an average of 17 per treatment. We also paid professors from top 50 schools of public health, as rated by US News and World Report in 2019, who study things like exercise and physiology. And they made 468 predictions. And then we had 90 practitioners from companies like Ideas 42, Behavioral Insights team, the Behavioral Insights team within Google. So folks who think about these kinds of problems, they made predictions as well. Let's see. Thank you to whoever said it was not boring. Okay, first of all, there's a little bit of predictive accuracy, maybe. If you look at the prolific workers, they end up being our best performers. So there's a correlation of 0.25 between what an actual treatment effect is and their prediction of the treatment effects, and it's marginally significant. But I just want to highlight that they're wildly over optimistic. So they think the treatment effects will be about 10 times bigger than they really are. So that's why the axes labels look very funny. I've cut them off. So the x-axis is actual treatment effects. The y is they're predicted. So they think these things will be way more effective. The public health professors were slightly less over optimistic, though still wildly overly optimistic. And they had absolutely no correlation effect. It was slightly negative in terms of what they thought would happen and what actually happened. And finally, the behavioral science professionals, they're the least overly optimistic, though still wildly overly optimistic, and also negative correlation between predictions and actual results. So here's another way of visualizing this. The blue data on the left shows you estimated treatment effects. And this is the graph I showed you earlier to show you that distribution. So you see all the estimated treatment effects. And then the orange graph, or the orange dots, show you the average change predicted by third-party observers in a given treatment. And it's not like they're predicting the tails well or something. It's really just noise. And the overall, if you pool the three samples and weight them equally, you get a correlation between predictions and actual performance of 0. So we're really bad at predicting what will work, which I think is pretty fascinating and probably more work to be done. You might also wonder if the scientists could predict what would work. We had the scientists do a different prediction exercise. In hindsight, we should have asked them a slightly different question. We basically said, will your hypothesis be supported in your specific study? And they predicted the likelihood their hypothesis would be right. And there was nothing there either in terms of actual correlation and estimated treatment effect. Okay, so let me conclude this, and I'm gonna then whiz through some vaccine mega study data, which is much simpler.
If I can ask you, if you can, we just hope to have a discussion for about 10 minutes. So if you can go over the other parts relatively.
I'll go really fast. All right, let's see. I'm not even going to conclude because So what came next, and I'll just give you the high level, is actually, I can do this in 5 minutes. We did 2 mega studies on vaccination. Both mega studies, I'll just give you sort of the high level, involve trying to text message people and encouraging them to get vaccines against the flu. And one of the mega studies was done with with 2 large healthcare providers, and we texted everyone who had an upcoming healthy visit to see a doctor in the fall, about 50,000 people. And the other study was done with Walmart pharmacies, and we're texting people who'd gotten a flu shot at Walmart in a previous year and encouraging them to come to the pharmacy and get one that year. So they seem like kind of different decisions. Will you accept a vaccine that's offered to you by your doctor when you see them the next, 3 days later, versus will you get in your car, drive to the pharmacy and ask for a vaccine? But we tested some different ideas and some similar ones. So this is the first study published in PNAS. It was all patients who had this primary care visit. There were 20 different conditions that scientists designed, and their condition determines what texts they get up in the 3 days prior to a visit. About 50,000 people in this population who were fairly diverse. And the vaccination rate in our holdout control group was 42%. And we're going to see, can we improve it over that? The holdout control just is business as usual. Normally, you don't get text messages about getting a flu vaccine at your doctor's appointment. You get text reminders to come, but no mention of the flu shot specifically. And we're layering on top of that additional text messages about the flu vaccine. And the first thing, hopefully this graph will look kind of familiar, because we have a placebo control, which is usual care. That's the dotted line. And then we have a whole bunch of treatments that we're comparing to that. And we're looking at their estimated treatment effects, as well as the 95% confidence intervals. Here we see 32% of treatments are outperforming usual care. So basically on average, we're seeing text messages. If we actually pool text message reminders to get a vaccine before a doctor's visit, are a significant predictor of vaccination, but there are some that are better than others. And the top performer in this particular context, which you can Bonferroni correct, whatever, you can do whatever correction you want basically, and it survives, was a very simple clinical message. There were lots of things tested that I will say were more creative and that I thought would be more effective. It was a simple message that looked like what you'd expect to get from your doctor. Here's the date and time. Look out for a vaccine reminder right before your appointment. And then 24 hours before, you're told a vaccine has been reserved for you at your appointment. And that was sort of the critical, we think, language that was used. That reserved for you language proved really effective. It was only used in 3 out of the roughly 20 messages, and those 3 were the top 3 performers in this trial. None of the others said a vaccine was reserved for you. They told you jokes about a vaccine. They were interactive. They asked you questions about yourself. They asked you if you wanted to dedicate this to a loved one, and none of that was very effective compared to this reserve for you language. When we did a sort of meta-analysis, that really pops out as the big winner. follow-up mega study done with, or actually parallel done with Walmart pharmacies. Here, everybody gets these nudges via text message in September of 2020, which is right at the beginning of flu season, and for up to 3 days after. Here we have almost 700,000 participants, a much bigger sample, so we have better precision in estimating treatment effects. And the vaccination rate in the holdout control group is 29%. Here, every single text message we tested outperformed control because we have really great precision. The biggest effect here is about a 10% increase, about a 2 percentage point or a 2.5 percentage point effect. It was about a 10% lift that we got in the context with physicians as well, but there was more like a 5 percentage point increase because we had a higher baseline. And interestingly, the two things that popped out of this were, first of all, we weren't allowed to use the language reserved for you in any of the messages. They replaced that with waiting for you. They were worried about stockouts. And so Walmart didn't feel comfortable with reserved for you, but it turned out waiting for you performed at the top of the heap just as reserved for you had. And again, all sorts of creative ideas, other things that were tested did not perform so well. The sort of key takeaways when we analyze the data across both studies that I'll just summarize are that emphasizing a vaccine being reserved or waiting for you outperformed everything else and rose to the top above all else in these tests. We also saw poor performance of messages that were interactive or felt unusual, like people who rated it said, I would not expect to get a message like that from my doctor or physician. We sent people jokes. They thought that was weird. Anything casual, surprising, and interactive performed poorly. And on the flip side, multiple reminders were more effective than single reminders, which makes a lot of sense. Basically, nagging worked. Prediction results here were a little bit more encouraging than in the setting that I told you about, but not a lot. Scientists still had total inability to predict the performance of treatments, but prolific workers were actually quite decent at predicting what would work in this context. So I don't know if it's an insider outsider bias. It's a bizarre result. The top performing message, though, was really hard for people to predict. It was ranked 15th on average by forecasters in both groups. So they had some correlational ability, but the ability to say, like, that's going to be what rises to the top, not so much. And then final thing I'll just say is that there was a very nice paper by a couple of our co-authors and my former student Heng-Chen Dai that basically took the idea about reserve for you and waiting for you to the field to encourage COVID-19 vaccinations and found that that kind of ownership language worked successfully when it was rolled out a couple months after our results. So that was really exciting because that was sort of the goal in the first place. So let me just leave up my conclusion slide while we talk and say, hopefully I've convinced you that there's some use in mega studies, but they have lots of limitations and I'm excited to have a conversation. I'm sorry I didn't leave enough time, but hopefully you appreciate my eagerness to share data. Okay, and I see a couple things in chat. Should I start there? Okay, great. All right, so Sarah, so you say, given that the average folks from Prolific were better at prediction, though still not super accurate, is there any thought on brainstorming the interventions themselves with a wider and more diverse community? Yeah, it's a great question. Like, maybe scientists shouldn't be designing these things because we're terrible at predicting what will work. Wouldn't it be great if we had more of an open process instead of having behavioral science experts come up with the interventions? Maybe like community members could develop and design great ideas. I think it's a great suggestion. It would be fun to do mega study tournaments that included not only scientific experts, but also practitioners and just community members. There's no reason we couldn't. The mega studies for very well suited to that kind of thing. So that would be exciting to see. We didn't do it in our first work because, you know, that's not, we started by trying to create a platform for researchers to do their science, but we could do that. And I think that would be fun. Okay,
Kinneret, you have a question, I see.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask something that already someone asked you about the post-intervention. So you have a few weeks, but our goal is like to maintain, and I'm not talking about vaccination, of course, there the goal is very immediate. But for the long term, you want to check them out like 1 year after, maybe even more. So do you have any of these interventions, do you have any data on that?
Are you talking about the gym or the vaccine?
The gym, because in the vaccine it's less relevant, right? Because you need
well, I was going to say we have it for both. So in the gym data we have a year of follow-up, and in the vaccine we have 6 months of follow-up, and we know when they get vaccines. So in both cases, we have very long-term follow-up data. In the gym data, I mean, everything is gone a year later. There's absolutely nothing that you can detect that far in the future. But I think you can see it. We do still see significant carryover effects when we pull the data like 10 weeks out. So this is what we're seeing is really consistent. I don't think we see anything novel at all compared to the habit formation literature. The carryover effects are almost exactly what you would expect based on all the past studies. It's like this 30% carryover, and then it trickles down a little bit. I think it's more like 20% over 10 weeks. So you just need a much more powerful boost in the treatment. The treatment would need to have a much, much bigger initial effect, which you might get if you paid people $100 instead of $2 or 20 cents in order to statistically see carryover for a year later.
No, but maybe something that is not a carryover, Mary. Maybe something that builds into the long term, and
right.
Maybe
But
the problem is the
maybe
incentive.
there was some like growth, and we do have a couple treatments where there's some growth. So I did a test of something I've studied before, which is called temptation bundling, where we like gave people something fun to connect with the gym. We gave them free audiobooks that they could listen
I
to.
remember that.
And that actually did grow over time. I don't know if I believe it. Like if you do correction for all the hypotheses we tested, I don't know if that really grew over time or if it's just an artifact. But that was the best in terms of like a growth trajectory of a treatment effect. It had a positive initial effect that was small, and then it grew. But we didn't see a lot of things like that. We were hoping we might, but we really didn't.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Shalom.
Thank you, Kathy. This is really fantastic and very interesting. Let me just ask a quick couple of questions from kind of a little bit of a policy perspective, because this is the motivation of the whole project. In a way, in the very success of what you're describing, which is really groundbreaking, is worrisome, not because of anything you did, but because of how it fits into the big picture of what behavioral science can do for policy, right? Because the implication is, which as behavioral scientists, we're not surprised by, that minute changes, right, can make enormous differences in the performance of different kinds of interventions. If you look at your original graph, like number 3 and number 53 were exceedingly close in a slight change, and it's not, and you can see it, I remember it from your PNAS study, which I saw in the past. Now, this means that we have a disconnect that is inevitable, right, between our basic research that we're all familiar and work on and the application that is beyond the traditional questions of external validity. This is more not whether the phenomena exists in the real world, which it does, but how to translate it in terms of these minute design details, which our intuitions, as you showed so beautifully, are so far from anything that happens on the ground. And what does it mean about behavioral research generally? And the reason this is a limitation, not only because it's kind of an ouch for behavioral scientists, but also if you think about it from a policy perspective, different kind of interventions, behavioral interventions, have very different policy implications. I mean, when you talk about going to the gym, there was a question about going too much, which was not a concern in a group of people who already registered for the gym and wanted to participate in the study and were not exercising much, and the magnitude of the effect is small. But you can imagine many other domains in which governments are continuously trying to nudge or thinking about nudging, where the differential effects of different kind of interventions in terms of are they potentially bad, potentially problematic, really depend in part on the psychological mechanisms that they activate, right? If I scare you so much that you have now anxiety and therefore you engage in certain activity, not like ceasing smoking, but something that is not so obviously harmful, maybe I will get differential effects. And the mega study doesn't let us do that. So how does it leave us with what we do with public policy?
So sorry, why does the mega study not let us tell if there are differential effects?
Oh, it will tell us the effects, but it wouldn't, because it doesn't go to the mechanism, right? We are kind of assuming that something will work. We're not even trying to really look at the underlying psychological mechanism. This is not what this is designed to do. Then ultimately the things that work best, we don't even know really why they work best. We can kind of expose, say, these features, look, saying it's reserved for you is more effective. We can then do a follow-up study and say, oh, that's probably, I don't know, loss aversion, endowment effect, or something else.
Yeah, well, so first of all, the mega study, I didn't focus on this because today's presentation was sort of more to show some of the policy relevant, but the mega study actually does allow you to do tightly controlled comparisons just like you would in another setting. And the reserved for you language was something that was proposed by one team, and they compared it with a tightly controlled group that got available for you as language and showed that that seemed to be the reserved for you really was the active ingredient. It isn't just our sort of meta analysis. So it is possible to do tightly controlled comparisons, and that's why the sub studies are important. But then we use the regular tools. There's a professor or a PhD candidate at UCLA named John Bogart, who then turned his dissertation on this issue of reserved for you and waiting for you and what's going on there, and did a series of many studies following up and digging into the mechanism. He's done really nice work. He thinks the active ingredient, or at least one of the key active ingredients from his research, is the exclusivity that you perceive when it's described this way. Of course, I think there's also an endowment effect that's in there, but he points to perceived exclusivity as at least part of it. So I think we have a lot of tools that allow us to dive into the mechanism. And we can also look at heterogeneity and response in a really nice way and say, like, is this backfiring for anyone? And that's one of the nice tools of a big population. We don't see backfiring. One other thing, and I realize we're at time, that I just want to mention, I will say while I was disappointed in some respect by the size of some of these treatment effects, more so in the gym, honestly, than in the vaccine studies, I don't think that this represents a ceiling for the effectiveness of nudges or behavioral science tools, because one of the limits actually of the mega study is that we're forced to create a level playing field that only allows for so much creativity and very tightly constrains what's possible. Because if we're going to move, if we're going to test 20 things, they can't vary on 500 dimensions, essentially. Text messages are incredibly cheap, incredibly limited way to communicate with people. And that's all we did in the vaccine trials. And so I suspect if we had many more degrees of freedom, we might see bigger effects. I don't think it's fair to assume that this is the best behavioral science can do. And I think a 10% boost in vaccination with 2 text messages is actually almost miraculous.
Okay, first of all, I want Katie to thank you for the great presentation. And because Ori is in charge of time, he will kill me if we don't end on time. So we will have to end the seminar now. But Katie, if you have a few more minutes, those who do have time can stay for 10 or 15 minutes more for more questions, if it's okay with you. So
yeah, I can stay for 10 more minutes, and I will actually try to just even in the chat respond to things in case.
That's really great. So those of you who have to go, thank you so much for coming. And those who want to stay with us for a few more questions are welcome to stay. Again, thank you so much. Konstantinos, you had a question before that, right?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for this great talk. I had seen the presentation of this mega study in the Behavioral Change for Good initiative, and I was following it closely, so I'm happy that now it has offspring. So there's 2 questions I have to ask. I posted them on chat already, but I would like to ask them also orally. So the first thing is, the first point is that this inability of experts to predict is something that Gigerenger's team has done a lot of research on, and they've shown that experts focus too much on non-informative details in a way. So maybe this was the best way to show that this is actually an accurate research result. But the second thing that is a real question is, did you ask participants regarding the distance they had to cover to go from their house to the gym? And I'm asking this because Arnold Schwarzenegger had said once that the most important element for people to go to the gym is for it to be very close to their house.
It's a great question. We have that data because we know the geocoordinates of their gym, and I think we know their address, which sounds creepy, but anyway, it's in a protected database and we don't have their name. And anyway, we could figure that out. I don't remember if we've looked at that or if the machine learning team has. I know we talked about it. We talked about everything from like weather to distance. I know there's a PhD student working with Wendy Wood, and I'm in Aras. I can't think of his last name, which is really embarrassing. Who has been focused on this very issue of distance and how it changes behavior. And he has some really nice correlational data showing that the further you are from vaccine centers, the less likely you are to get vaccinated. And I think he even has some identification off of, the mass sites that opened and closed in the US to show that it looks causal. So I completely agree. And of course, there's other data that looks at distance as a barrier to change as well. I completely agree with you. It's a relevant barrier, but I don't think we have looked at it as an individual difference to see if like some treatments overcame that better than others, but I think we could.
Thank you.
A question from the chat of Anna Walter. Many of the top 5 treatments, the gym study, refer to dollar incentives, and policymakers often have limited budget. How? Were the results implemented?
Yeah, it's a great question. The dollar incentives were so minuscule because we had a limited budget, and we also calibrated to try to think about, like, given the policy value of an extra gym visit, what's a reasonable incentive that someone might actually want to deploy to change this behavior? So that's why we were in the order of magnitude of 20 cents. There are some organizations that are implementing. I'm actually presenting this to the CEO of Equinox Gyms, which is one of the biggest gym chains in the US. Tomorrow, 24 Hour Fitness is well aware of them and has their own app. I'm forgetting, it's called like 24 Go, where they've built the planning devices, and they do have some reward schemes. I don't think it's literally for pennies convertible to Amazon Cash, but I think there's other rewards that are order of magnitude similar that they're using. So there has been interest in sort of deploying these things, and there's all sorts of different programs out there at the employer level that are incentivizing physical activity as measured by gym attendance and or often like these wearables and like how many steps you take, and you can get points convertible for rewards. So there has been interest. I don't think the incentives are a barrier to deployment because they were so low, and that's why we went with such small numbers, honestly. I mean, part of it, the other was literal budget constraint.
Sarah, I hope I pronounced your name correctly.
Yes. Hi. Thank you. Thanks, Katie. This is really, really interesting. Following up a little bit on that last question, I'm wondering if you're aware of, or if you're doing any studies where, rather than looking at either like the wearables of wearing something like a Fitbit or actual gym attendance, if there are other studies where looking at like app-based exercise engagement. So, and I'm thinking about that both from a pragmatic level. So it would be a more constrained population of people who would be joining a gym and traveling to a gym, and I'm not in that population because of my lifestyle. And then even I'm thinking from a conceptual question, this idea about re-engagement is really interesting to me, and I think very important to these broader questions of habit formation and persistence over time. And I wonder if those effects might be larger and easier to see when you're looking at behaviors that don't necessarily require travel and present the kinds of obstacles that might require.
Yeah, those are great questions. So anyway, there are many reasons we did this with a gym, including large prior literature on habit formation. Right. The gym is sort of like the fruit fly zone for us. I think some of the previous studies get around your concerns a little bit better and show similar levels of effects and also carryover, in that they look at college populations who all have access because they're enrolled in a college that has a gym on campus to a nearby gym that they're automatically members of. And those results look pretty similar in terms of a lot of things we care about. I have done some work with wearables, but again, as you point out, like those are, while they're widely distributed, they're still income effects. Kevin Volp's group at Penn has done some research where they just give you a wearable. So like you don't have to own a wearable to be in the study, they hand it to you. And again, I think they've seen some similar things. There's a Framingham Heart study project where they gave wearables to people in that group and saw that things like gamification had big benefits. So I'm not super worried about the external validity because there now are so many studies on physical activity with different populations and different approaches that tend to show, I would just say, convergent validity, that like these little things that we try can change attendance maybe anywhere from 30% to 200%. That's the rough range, depending on how big the incentives are and how strong the engagement is. And then they all sort of see carryover effects for up to 12, 24 weeks that drop off, but are still detectable. So I think we're in range,
Right.
But yeah, it'd be nice to take this to other settings. But my guess is you'd see similar things. Like I believe that this is probably pretty externally valid.
Yeah, and I guess to just to clarify, it was less a question of like, would this generalize, but more, might this be like a very conservative test given the kinds of constraints of going to a gym, and might with other types of more at-home programs, potentially, might you see actually bigger effects or more scalable interventions? That's more the general question there.
I don't know. It's a really great question. I could imagine it going either way. So it could be that because these are already people who are gym members and they're excited, like it's harder to get an effect, or because they're excited and they're interested, they're paying attention, it's easier to get an effect. So I don't know if it's conservative or not. But we'll do follow-up work and try to figure that out. I'm particularly excited about following up on the small motivation to not let a streak of one miss accumulate. I think that's very promising. So we'll look at that in other settings too. I think study habits, things like Duolingo, there's lots of places we could look at this.
Okay, because we're running out of time, the last question from chat of Sumitava: how do you decide which are the nudges that are worth testing? Theoretically, they can be always plenty.
Oh, such a great question. And by the way, I hope that we are not going to be like the only team doing mega studies, and that others, and in fact, I've had calls with a number of teams in the last couple of weeks that are thinking about launching similar studies. And there was Jay Van Bavel and Dave Rand launched a mega study that was a totally open tournament on trying to figure out ways to reduce polarization. So like, I don't think we have one formula that should be applied for all mega studies. We did this in a very, I will say, like organic way, and that this all grew out of a grant proposal that was put together with a team of collaborators who Angela and I had worked with before on various, like the way science normally happens. It was just a bigger team because we pulled in like all of our previous collaborators instead of one or two. And then we basically said, like, tell us your best ideas. And in the gym study, I think we actually launched everything that was proposed that was possible to program. There was no selection except, can it literally be done? Because we had a big population. In the vaccine study, we had to be a little bit more selective because we'd grown the number of people who were involved in the project from the original like 30 people who submitted a grant together to like all of their students and collaborators who they pulled in, and it's just gotten a little bit bigger over time. And so we got, I think, 75 submissions and eventually launched something like 30 of them. And honestly, the selection mechanism is terrible because it was experts deciding, is this interesting? And we know that experts are not able to predict what works. So in hindsight, it was a silly selection, but at some level, because Angela and I were doing all the work to make this happen, choosing the things we found most interesting and exciting, I think was not an insane process, and that, we get to pick what we want to work on the most. But I think, maybe having prolific workers rate things in the future and decide what advances would be a better process if the goal is to advance the most promising ideas. But, I think as other teams launch their own mega studies, I hope each will try different processes and we'll get better at figuring out how do you filter. There's also a lot of like, oh, sorry, that's illegal. Or like, that's actually not possible. So that filters the field a fair amount in our experience. But we also haven't gone to a completely open submission process, even though some other teams have, again, because of like it's already overwhelming to get 75 submissions, and thinking if we open this to the whole world, how many we could get and how you filter it's a little overwhelming. But I think that's like the future of mega studies, is figuring this all out. So anyway, thank you for the great question.
Thank you. This was absolutely great. The last and personal question from me is, how do you manage to give such a great talk and simultaneously answer the chat questions? This puzzles me, definitely puzzles me. I envy you on that. As many people wrote in the chat, amazing talk. Thank you so, so much. It was very interesting and informative. And we are looking
Thank you so much
forward
for
to
having me and for the amazing work done by so many of the people here. I'm a huge fan, and it was an honor to get to speak to your crew. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye to everyone. Thank you for coming.